오늘 서울대학교 인문대 서어서문학과의 폴 스니드 교수님 강연의 사회를 맡은 저는 같은 인문대학의 고고미술사학과에서 미술사를 전공하는 장진성입니다. 먼저 강연에 앞서서 서울대학교 중앙도서관장이신 인문대 영어영문학과의 김명환 교수님의 축사인가요? 예, 간단한 인사 말씀 있으시겠습니다.
예, 여러분 반갑습니다. 중앙도서관장 김명환입니다. 출판문화원하고 중앙도서관이 이렇게 함께 협력해서 하는 서울대학교 출판문화원 저술강연 저자에게 직접 듣는다의 두 번째 시간입니다. 오늘은 인문대 서어서문학과의 폴 스니드 교수님의 강연을 듣게 되어 기쁘게 생각을 합니다. 저는 이 500페이지 가까운 책인데요. 이 머신건 보이스를 저자로부터 직접 듣는 것이 굉장히 의미 있다고 생각을 합니다. 저 자신 책을 자세히 못 읽어봤고 500페이지나 되는 큰 이 책입니다. 그리고 저는 브라질은 물론 남미 국가도 방문해 본 적이 없어서 이 책을 좀 훑어보면서 파벨라 펑크 또는 펑크 카리오카 그리고 리오데자네이로의 빈민촌인 로싱하 이런 얘기를 처음 들어봤습니다. 그러나 이 리오데자네이로의 빈민촌에서 역동적으로 발전해 나간 이 음악에 대해서 이 저자인 폴 스니드 교수가 가지고 있는 열정과 그 애정을 굉장히 느낄 수가 있었습니다. 제가 찾아보니까 올해 2020년은 폴 스니드 선생님이 리오데자네이로를 간 30주년이 되는 날입니다. This is your 30th anniversary, right? 이건 굉장히 한 사람의 학자로서 큰 노력을 하신 것이고 큰 의미가 있다고 생각하고요. 한 가지 마지막으로 덧붙일 것은 우리 서울대학교가 있는 이 봉천동, 신림동 그리고 좀 떨어진 난곡까지 이 지역도 사실은 1970년대, 80년대에는 굉장히 가난한 동네였습니다. 파벨라였던 거죠. 그래서 서울대학교 학생들이 야학을 하면서 그 가난한 동네 학생들을 가르치기도 했었습니다. 지금은 완전히 달라졌지만 이런 그 빈민촌 또는 우리말로 달동네 이 파벨라의 그 경험과 역사는 우리에게도 있다고 생각이 되고요. 아직도 난곡에는 그렇게 이런 곳이 아직도 남아있나 싶은 가난한 동네가 있다고 알고 있습니다. 오늘의 이 강연이 우리 현실에 대해서도 돌아보고 또 이 브라질의 경험을 통해서 굉장히 많은 것을 배울 수 있으리라고 생각합니다. 네, 감사합니다.
먼저 폴 스니드 교수님 강연에 앞서서 제가 폴 스니드 교수님에 대해서 간략하게 양력을 말씀드리고 그리고 또 외국인 학생들이나 우리말을 좀 조금 서투르신 분이 있을까봐 영어로 간단하게 양력을 다시 말씀드린 다음에 폴 스니드 선생님에게 마이크를 넘기도록 하겠습니다. 폴 스니드 교수님은 그러니까 1992년에 유니버시티 오브 버지니아 주립대학에서 학사를 하셨고요. 1995년에 유니버시티 오브 위스콘신 메디슨에서 포르투갈어와 예술로 석사를 마치시고 2003년에 유니버시티 위스콘신 메디슨에서 포르투갈어와 역사 디파트먼트에서 박사를 하셨습니다. 그 이후로 위스콘신 메디슨, 그 다음에 오클라호마 대학교, 그 다음에 샌디에고 주립대학교, 캔자스 주립대학교에서 근무하시고 학생들을 가르치시다가 2014년 9월에 서울대학교 인문대 서어서문학과 교수로 부임을 하셨습니다. In order to let you know what's going on here, I introduce you very briefly in English. Okay. Professor Sneed received his BA in Political and Social Thought from the University of Virginia in 1992 and his MA and PhD in Portuguese and History from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1995 and in 2003, respectively. He had taught at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, University of Oklahoma, San Diego State University, University of Kansas, before he joined the faculty of Seoul National University in 2014. He has long been interested in the urban activism and its utopian aspirations found in Rio de Janeiro, Rio's favelas, low-income informal settlements in Brazil, and has published numerous scholarly articles on the subject. Professor Sneed, while living and working in the favela of Hosinha, conducted in-depth research on the rise of Brazilian gangster funk. Machine Gun Voices, Favelas and Utopia in Brazilian Gangster Funk, published by Seoul National University Press in 2019, is the result of his long-term research. Today, Professor Sneed will talk in detail about the motivation, purpose, and content of the book, and his talk, entitled Brazilian Gangster Funk Then and Now, will offer a rare opportunity for us to learn about the urban activism of the low-class people in Rio. That is a fascinating yet unfamiliar topic to us. Please join me in welcoming Professor Sneed.
Hello, everybody. It's such a tremendous honor for me to be here. I'm sorry about that, the moment of silence that we were observing there at the beginning of the talk. We can have that be for all of the people that were involved in this project, and just as an homage to them. The idea was that we were going to play you a short selection of a song called Happy do Comando Vermelho, the rap of the Red Command Criminal Faction by MC Mascote, which came out around 2000. I wanted to give you a chance. You can go and look it up on YouTube later. I wanted to give you a chance to hear as many samples of the music as we can today, and see some pictures as well, to give you something to listen to besides just me, and to give you something to look at. The first thing that I want to say today is I want to thank some of the people that have helped bring this together, this event and the book. And before I mention the folks that are on my list, we have this amazing group of technicians here, of PDNIM and producers that are helping. I'm very grateful for them. I came in with a lot of kind of complicated things that I'm trying to do with the technology, and they're handling it with tremendous grace, so I really appreciate that. I want to thank first and foremost Kim Mi-jin, the editor from the SNU Press, who was with me, encouraging me throughout the book, from the time I began seriously undertaking revising my manuscript and producing this. And other folks there at SNU Press, in particular An Hyung-uk, who was the first person to actually deal with the editing of the text when I turned it into the press. But everybody at SNU Press, from the design team to everything, has been tremendous, and it's been an absolute pleasure. And the book is no doubt much better for your love and attention that you've given it. I have been very happy with it. And also there was another editor, kind of a personal editor, Professor Travis Smith from our Asian Studies program here, professor of religious studies and Hinduism and Sanskrit. Terrific editor. And if you don't have the chance to read this book, which is quite long, and you just want to read one part, I would recommend the final chapter, Last Dance. I'll tell you just an inside story here. When I first wrote this manuscript, I had a very different last chapter, and Professor Smith, called me out on it, and he said it was basically threatening to ruin a good book. So he really pushed me to change it. I'm so glad he did. Gave me a better chance to reflect on this work from a new perspective. And anyway, I'm quite pleased with that. I also want to thank Professor Jung Byung-sol from Korean Language and Literature, the director of the editor-in-chief and director of the SNU Press, who also has been very encouraging. And my colleague, Chan Jing-sung, for the wonderful introduction, as well as my new colleague here from Korea University, Kim So-yeon, who also has been handling all of the expectations of dealing with this complex PowerPoint very well, and I appreciate that. Also, I thank Professor Kim Myung-hwan. Thank you also for your introduction. I enjoyed that perspective. Also, Kim Ji-won from the SNU Library in charge of the series. Thanks so much for your work in helping bring this together. And last but not least, Timmy Gogan for help putting together the slides. Thank you, Timmy. And last but not least, I would like to thank my colleagues and students in the Spanish department, humanities, and throughout Seoul National University in the time that I've been here. I really appreciate all the support and enthusiasm for this project. Also, I wanted to mention that some of this work was supported by the SNU Research Grant in 2018 and overseas training expenses for humanities and social science through SNU in 2019, which brought me to the Center for Korean Studies at the University of Hawaii. I appreciate the help of those folks there too. So we played about a minute of the song Happy do Comando Vermelho, the rap of the Red Command Criminal Faction from MC Mascote in 2000. And I wanted to make a brief comment about that. I wanted to offer up an example for you to have something to listen to there of the kind of gangster funk that's at the heart of this book project. This proibidão, as it's called in Portuguese, or forbidden funk, has been an underground movement from the beginning, something that's not played on radios or sold in stores, but mostly performed live at the community funk dance parties, held often by, not always, but often by the gangsters in favelas. So I won't be explaining in great detail, but at least you could get a chance to hear some of that. One of the reasons that it's important to start with a reference that connects us to those community dance parties is because those dance parties are really the heart and the epicenter of Brazil's favela funk. From the beginning, whether it was just inside the favela or outside the favela, the spaces of the dances, the gatherings of people to make the music have really been at the heart of this movement. And this is where not only is music made, but where slang arises, different expressions that are used, kinds of styles of dancing and dress, so fashion. And really it's probably even more importantly kind of where the essence of the favela funk movement has been found. So I'm going to do a bit of reading today because I want to try to stick somewhat close to the Korean subtitles. So I appreciate your patience with me. I'll try to read it as naturally as I can. But at its core, funk music is a transformational and countercultural practice through which these young people experience a sense of unity and find a greater sense of courage to resist the wearying effects of the harsh realities they face on a daily basis. In the space of the Bailes funk, a densely significant and complex musical culture is conjured up and sustained. In the creation of the collective moment and space of funk musical experience in the Baile, those gathered can lift one another above the limitations of their ordinary lives to an emotional state that enables them to feel what it's like to live in a better world. And I'm paraphrasing a bit, but that quote comes from page 260 of the book. I guess it took me about that long to get to the point. So anyway, if you have a copy of the book, you can find that. I wanted to mention some of the things that I've learned just briefly and that I've noticed about being involved in this study. And one is I definitely learned a lot about favela funk. Funk carioca, Brazilian funk, that has different names that it's called. Learned a lot about the music. I also learned a lot about Brazilian society. And I hope that in this book you can learn a lot about the music and you can learn about Brazilian society. But there was something else that I found about the human condition, something that's more universal, something, over the decades that I've been studying funk, I definitely learned more than I expected. And I would say that you don't just learn about, favela funk music and Brazilian politics and society, although those things are very important, but also about the human condition more universally, and I'll try to make a connection in that direction in just a bit. So moving on to the next slide. Oh, and I guess, actually, do you mind jumping back? Can you jump back to one? Yeah, just in terms of the words that I have written here on my PowerPoint. These dance parties have been, I'm using the term hegemonic hideouts. They've been a place where ideologically there's a countercultural space created. And then I mentioned here sort of psychologically, that together as people meet in these spaces, there's a feeling, a utopian feeling of what it would be like to live in a better world. But they're also more than just ideology, and they're more than just words, or more than even just feelings. These are spaces of a community counter in which people are renewed in a very physiological sense, coming together as a community. So that's the kind of refuge that's made available in this space, and those are some of the things that are important about them. Thanks a lot. So I want to tell you a little bit about funk carioca, favela funk. It has its origins in the dance parties of the young, mostly black and racially mixed poor inhabitants of Rio de Janeiro in the early 1970s, set to the sounds of African American soul and funk. The music of these bailes funk, is the term that's used in Portuguese, evolved along with the advent of electronic music and hip-hop, primarily through the influence of styles like electro-funk, Latin freestyle, and Miami bass, with groups and artists like Two Live Crew, Grandmaster Flash, Stevie B, and DJ Battery Brain. Due to the mass gang fighting in many dance halls across the city's low-income suburbs in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the bailes funk relocated to Rio's informal, low-income favela communities. There, funk carioca underwent a crucial shift as local MCs and DJs began performing in Portuguese to address the daily lives of Rio's poor youths. They also started playing the proibidão style that I mentioned, as Brazilian gangster funk is called in Portuguese, and is sometimes translated as forbidden funk, often in homage to the criminal factions who ostensibly controlled those communities and hosted those parties. Today, funk has gone from occasional moments of citywide and nationwide fame and popularity to enormous popularity worldwide. So, you know, many people presumably listening to my talk today maybe haven't heard of favela funk, and that's understandable. You've probably heard of some of the cousins of favela funk from the Black Atlantic world, certainly hip hop, and probably reggaeton, perhaps Jamaican dancehall, some of these other kinds of electronic forms of urban youth music and Afro-Atlantic music. But funk from Brazil has become so popular in recent years, especially through the YouTube channel of Condzilla, or sort of like Godzilla with Condzilla. The time that we published the book, Condzilla had the 6th most popular YouTube station in the world. So this is a style of music that is not just important, you know, locally in Rio de Janeiro anymore. It's really spread out throughout the country and throughout the world. So with that, since so much time has gone by since the last song that we listened, the 2000 recording, I wanted to play you something a little more recent. We're going to listen to Vai Malandra by Anitta, featuring Zach Major, DC, Yuri Martins, and Tropiquilas. And this is from 2018. So we'll hear something that's a little more the kind of contemporary style.
Acredito que só tocar o. Você acredita? Olha lá, toda animadinha, olha lá. Brincando mesmo, tá louco. Vai malandra, eita louca, tô brincando com bumbum. Vai malandra, eita louca, tô brincando com bumbum. Pedindo, se prepara, vou dançar, presta atenção. Se aguenta, se eu te olhar, descer, quicar até o chão. Fala brincando, ó. Desce, rebola gostoso, empina me olhando, eu te pego de jeito. Se eu começar embrasando contigo, é taca, 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 taca. Isso, rebola gostoso, empina te olhando, te pego de jeito. Se eu começar embrasando contigo, é... Não vou mais parar, cê vai aguentar. Não vou mais parar, cê vai aguentar. Vai malandra, show me some. Brazilian baby, you know I want you.
bitch, sit a glass on me. See my zipper, put that.
Sorry to have to pause that in the middle of the song again. So, as I mentioned, this is much more contemporary sound of funk, kind of in its internet phase of today, and its more close approximation with other styles of world popular music and pop music. And you can hear there also the participation of the American singer-rapper Major. So it's much less recognizable as funk, but still considered to be funk music. And I'm not going to talk too much about the lyrics of any of the songs that I play today. I'm sorry that I won't have as much time to do lyrical analyses as I'd like. I do lots of that in the book, and so hopefully if you're interested in that, you can always look things up in the book. But I did just want to mention that that particular song is pretty much a sensual kind of a song about seduction and flirtation. Well, one of the reasons that I'm trying to play these selections, and as we go on maybe to the next slide here, is because so many people in our audience potentially haven't listened to favela funk and don't know too much about it, I know that it would really be a tremendous omission not to include at least some of the music. So I'll be including a couple of more tracks. But unfortunately, since this isn't a radio show, we really don't have a whole lot of time to get into the music and to listen to it. So one of the things I recommend, if you're interested, just back in January, I had an opportunity to appear on the Brazilian Experience on Hawaiian Public Radio with my friend Sandy Tsukiyama, and she had me play tons of music. So if you just look up, if you go do like a search for the Brazilian Experience Sneed, it should come up, and then you can listen to that music. There's the history of funk, there's kind of current type music, and then there's also a section on gangster funk in particular, and then even some other kinds of contemporary Brazilian music that are alternative, not as mainstream styles. So that's one way that you can try to connect to the style. Another way that you can connect, now obviously, if you're fortunate enough to be able to go to a baile funk, to go to a favela funk dance party, then that's even better for those of you that are in Brazil. But for many people that won't be possible. You can certainly get some kind of a representation of funk through television and film, and even some famous movies like City of God, which is a famous movie here in Korea and internationally, will have a portrayal of kind of the early days of funk. A more recent portrayal would be in the movie Elite Squad, Tropa de Elite from 2007. And then most recently, if you have Netflix, there's a Netflix original series called Sintonia. You can watch it here in Korea or wherever you are. And that will also give you some representations of this. As far as documentaries about this topic, I have been very interested in the question of how funk has been represented in documentaries. I have a recent article that came out on that topic. If you're interested, you could look that up also. It's called Brazil's Favela Funk in Film. My favorite, you can see here on my PowerPoint, is Funky Rio by Sergio Goldenberg from 1994. This I kind of have as my all-time best pick for favela funk documentaries. There's lots of reasons that I think that that's the case. I think that this would be the best companion for Machine Gun Voices, even though it is the first. This is the first documentary, and it's really from the early days of funk in Brazil, where most of the lyrics were still in English, but there were local ways of dancing, local ways of speaking, and famously there were many of the dances of the day had a kind of semi-ritualized, I'll just call it combat, something like a mosh pit at a punk rock show, where people would come together, side A and side B would come together and they would clash. And that's explained very well in this extremely relational and humanizing film, which is a real gem as a work of cinema, besides a representation of funk. But one of the reasons that I think it's such a good companion to Machine Gun Voices is because really the stars of Funky Rio are not MCs, DJs, producers, or other industry figures. Although, of course, these people are very important. But the real star of this movie are just everyday people. They're just young people that go to the dances and make it happen with their bodies, with their hearts, with their voices, with their love, and also with their fighting, whatever it happens to be. So the focus on just everyday people, not really looking at funk as a style, as a genre, but more as a movement. I think that's very, very interesting. And that brings it a little more in line with my book. And another reason is because it focuses on the dance party. So when I'm talking about dance parties, everyone here has probably been to a dance party at some point in time. One of the big differences between these favela funk dance parties and, say, a concert is the level of circularity. If you go to a party, there isn't usually a front side and a back side. It's not really like you're looking at a stage and then the people on stage are looking at you. The audience and the crowd, the performance and the crowd are very much mixed. So in that sense, funk is an heir to other kinds of related forms of Black Atlantic culture in Brazil, like the candomblé, the West African-inspired animist religious practices, which they still are. They're very circular in nature in the way they're practiced. And I see these as a real kind of foundational space for Brazilian popular culture and especially Afro-Brazilian culture. Another example, which has kind of grown out of that, would be the Afro-Brazilian martial art of capoeira, which also is musical. It's also done in a circle. It blends the audience and the performance really into one seamless community encounter. And it has the antiphony, what Paul Gilroy would call the antiphony of that call and response that really helps bring people into the present moment there. Samba, another one of the widely known and great forms of Afro-Brazilian culture that really has its kind of origins in these same kind of roda, the roda de samba, the circular type encounter. And really in other spaces throughout the Black Atlantic world, like things I mentioned, like hip hop, reggaeton, reggae, Jamaican dancehall, all of these kind of have these sort of circular spaces as a part of their history and as a part of their development. So let's go on to the next slide there. And for this slide, this is one of the reasons that I was thanking the folks here in the production team, because what my plan is for you to relax and take a chance to look through some photos from the photo gallery. This is the photo gallery from the beginning of the book. And I'm going to put on another track for you by DJ Sandrinho called Berimbau, in reference to the instrument from that capoeira martial art I just explained. Just kick back and soak in the photos with your eyes a bit while we listen to this music, and I'm going to resist the temptation to speak for a bit. We still have some pictures to look at, so I'll just talk through the rest of these pictures. And you can see we're having a little bit of a technical problem with the way the computer's reading my file. I think it's because I created this on a Mac and we're looking at it on a PC. So anyway, you can still get a pretty good chance to look at some of these pictures. Many of these pictures, you'll notice, were taken in Rocinha, the favela where I lived and worked for many years, but not all of them. Some are taken in other locations in Rio. We're kind of nearing the end. I always get a kick out of showing this picture because if you can't recognize the person in the middle of it, that's me there with my friends Adiki and Sergio. And I think there's just a couple more. Oh, that's a great picture to see there. A picture from the youth group from one of the churches there. And students at the kind of the heir to the Two Brothers Foundation today. A shot of one of the relatively frequent incursions by police and military, and then looks like the last picture got kind of knocked out there. So that's another attempt for me to give you something to listen to and something to look at, and you can get a feel for the context from which favela funk has arisen, and definitely a feel for the tone of the book, which is much more on, as I said, focus on everyday people. Although I do plenty of lyrical analysis and talked with other MCs and DJs and things like that. But I want to take this opportunity. You can just take a look at the cover of the book here and think a little bit about, maybe how this represents the various tensions that are at play in trying to represent this story in a book. While I read you a quick little blurb here on how favela funk won me over. So when I moved to the favela of Rocinha in 1990, 30 years ago, as was pointed out in the beginning of our session today, I was doing a study abroad in Brazil, and I was in college. I made a friend who lived in Rocinha. I met her at a program for helping alcoholics and drug addicts stop using. And later I had an opportunity to move in with her family and to conduct a study on what I considered to be the rule of the gangsters, sort of the law of the criminal faction there in the favela, and how everyday people interpreted and experienced it and lived it. Funk music at that time in 1990 was very new in Portuguese, and it was pretty new in Brazil anyway. I can tell you this, I didn't like funk music when I first heard it, this favela funk. I did not like the Brazilian favela funk when I first heard it. And I had many dear friends in the community that kept sharing it with me, especially the younger people, bringing me different tapes and telling me about why this music was important in their lives and why I should be excited about it too. So over time, 3 things happened that I wanted to point out today. The first was, as I mentioned, these young friends in the favela got me interested in their funk music and what it meant to them, and I kind of started to put this on my horizon as something that maybe I could dig deeper into in my research. Second, I had a conversion to Christianity. So that was something that I didn't expect to have happen and was an important thing in my life there in the favela of Rocinha. And thirdly, I worked with some of my friends that I met there to found a binational nonprofit educational center there in the favela. In the US, we founded this as the Two Brothers Foundation, and in Brazil as the Instituto dos Irmãos. And it's a long and complicated story to talk about that, but I'm very grateful for those years that I was able to be involved in that project with my friends there in Rocinha and actually other friends from around the world that were involved in it. It was a really meaningful chapter in my life. So though the nonprofit work was separate from my research, unintentionally, it helped me to understand the music better, to live in the favela as a community educator. Of course, it slowed down the research considerably. That's one of the reasons we don't advise our students to start a nonprofit organization or they're trying to finish a PhD. Likewise, well, it helped me work better with the nonprofit to understand the music and culture of the young generation. Not that everybody that was in our project liked the favela funk. There were all sorts of different people with different musical tastes, but certainly it was very relevant, and it did help me to understand what was going on, to know more about the music and to know more about that context. So the people that I met there living in Rocinha for those years, this added up to, over the couple of decades that I was in and around Rocinha, it added up to about 4 or 5 years. I met these folks there that have been true friends to me all these years and have taught me at least as much about life as I've ever learned in my studies. So with that, I'm gonna give you a couple ideas that I have about why favela funk is important. Now, here in Korea, this isn't really a controversial topic to be studying this. In Brazil, when studies are done and when studies get attention, there's all kinds of criticism that comes, and then there's all sorts of politics involved about how it plays out. But I'll tell you that from my point of view, as I have permanent residence in Brazil, I've lived in Brazil, my wife is in Brazil, and I have a lot of family and friends in Brazil. But really, in some ways, I get to be a little bit of an outsider, which is nice. It gives me a little bit of a different perspective, and it extricates me a bit from that politics. For me, some of the reasons that it's important is to give voice to the mostly black and racially mixed youths of the favelas, to tell their stories and represent their lives in a mass cultural expression, especially because favela funk is so often sensationalized or romanticized in an objectifying way. So, usually you either think funk is, lots of people will say funk is trash, favela funk is trash, or then the other side will say favela funk is culture. And for me, there's all kinds of different aspects of favela funk. There are some very important liberating aspects of it, and then there are also some problematic aspects of the culture. So to try not to be too sensationalist or too romantic about it, but to be more relational. So I think that's one of the reasons that it's important for the people that are involved. As I'm coming to you today, I think about so many friends, really close friends that have been dear to me, and I think, what would they say if they knew that today I was giving this talk, and those folks would be so happy to have their stories represented. They were so encouraging and supportive of me in doing this research. But also for the audience, for you guys, I think it's an opportunity to have a greater understanding of a community that you might not have real easy access to in a relational and a dialogical way. One of the big differences of this book now as a finished product from my doctoral research earlier on is all of the much more in-depth ethnographic kind of all of the stories, all of the voices of the people. And I'm so glad that that's able to come through more. Not as much as I would like, but more. Also, for us, in terms of trying to understand Brazilian society and its historical tensions in a contemporary context, I think that studying favela funk is very critical. It's actually quite similar to the kinds of things that have been at the core of Brazilian intellectual life for over a century. Things like the famous Rebellion in the Backlands, the Os Sertões by Euclides da Cunha from 1902, in which issues about race and identity and marginality and power and all of these kind of things were so important, considered a classic in Brazilian intellectual life. And similarly, Casa Grande e Senzala, The Master and the Slaves by Gilberto Freire in 1933, another work which is really at the core of has been at the core of Brazilian ideology and the idea, all of the discourse about race and the debates about that for all these years. Beyond the question of the fans and even us today here for what we can learn about Brazil, I mentioned that for me, this journey that I've had in having this relationship with the folks there in Rocinha and a relationship with this musical movement is that yes, I have seen, come to know something about the music in Brazilian society, but I also, in this community encounter aspect, in this coming together in a live space, this kind of relationality, I have seen something much more about the human condition really in any situation and our common needs for relationship and community, for coexistence, not just tolerating one another, but existing with one another, being something different when we're together, something, hopefully something stronger and something with more hope, with more joy, with more love for one another. One of the things that you often hear about, like me as a scholar who works with this topic, I'm often asked about sexism in the music. And so I wanted to say a few things about that. It's beyond the scope of my talk to resolve the debate. And it's actually even beyond the scope of my book to resolve the debate. There are some wonderful studies which I do list in the book that focus much more on the representation of women in particular, or aspects of misogynism and things like that in funk. But what I did want to say is that it is a debate. So you might think like, well, funk is just, favela funk and Brazilian music from the favelas is just automatically misogynistic and sexist, and that's the end of the story. Well, there are people that say that. But you should also know that there's another group of scholars and group of people, just everyday people, that affirm quite the opposite, that favela funk has been a liberating space for women, and it's been a space for a sort of proto-feminism in giving women agency. So like I said, I'm not going to resolve that. I think that I think that there are aspects of both of these happening in funk, and that's what I was telling you before. It's not really all this or all that. It's something along a spectrum. There's different moments and different figures within the movement. It's very complex. But one thing that I wanted to share, a couple of songs that might give a kind of a glimpse into this second side, this more, the sort of feminism. And we're going to listen to a song which is called 100% Feminista, 100% Feminista, 100% Feminist. We're going to listen to that in a minute. But before we do, I wanted to say that there's another song which you can look up. I'll have it on a slide at the end of the talk, which shows the names of the artists and the title of the track. And you can look that up and pause the presentation and look it up as you'd like. But there's a song by Tati Quebra-Barraco, an enduring, probably the most enduring female figure in the history of funk. And MC Carol, more newer generation, coming together to do a song, and you'll excuse these are some curse words that I'm using here, but Mamãe da Putaria, the mother of whorishness. So you can see right there some of the tensions between whether this is misogynistic and sexist or whether this is in some way some sort of represents some kind of liberation. But this is a much more implicit kind of a view in which the women MCs in the video denounce the objectification of women by men, which is so typical in Brazilian society historically, by reversing the tables on the men in a playful way that really makes the women the ones that are objectifying the men. So it's an interesting song. We don't have time to listen to it, but you can look it up and watch, even watching the video. If you don't understand the words, you're certainly going to understand. I think you'll get pretty clearly what's going on there. But now let's go ahead and just listen for a moment to 100% Feminista, 100% Feminist by MC Carol and Carol com K. I'll explain that in just a moment.
Presenciei tudo isso dentro da minha família. Mulher com o olho roxo, espancado todo dia. Eu tinha uns 5 anos, mas já entendia que mulher apanha se não fizer comida. Mulher oprimida, sem voz obediente. Quando eu crescer, eu vou ser diferente. Eu cresci. Prazer, Carol bandida, representa as mulheres. 100% feminista, eu cresci. Prazer, Carol bandida, representa as mulheres. 100% feminista, representa Qualtune, represento Carolina, gente não aceita opressão. Abaixa sua voz, abaixa sua mão.
Okay, so yeah, that was MC Caral from Rio, from the funk, Movimento Funk, Favela Funk, and Caral com K, which means Carol with a K, who's from the south of Brazil and is more of a hip hop artist. And this is a partnership, a joint venture for the two of them, which sings about the historic oppression of women and how they're flipping it and how they're turning it over, how they're not going to wash dishes and have a black eye from getting hit because they didn't cook and things like that. Talk about some of their childhood experiences of the kinds of violence against women in their lives and take a very firm stance against that. And, you know, I mean, I don't think that anybody's going to say that this is not sort of an example of a more feminist moment in funk. But I guess what you could say is this is not really usually the most popular type of funk songs. In terms of if you look at YouTube and you see the number of views, you know, some funk songs are going to get up to even 1 billion views. Some of them are going to be in the top 20 or all-time most viewed videos in the world. And some of this kind of stuff is probably quite popular, but not that popular. So that's also something to say. Well, I prepared a kind of an optional slide, which it looks like I might have a little bit of time to comment on, so I'll just go ahead and tell you what I was thinking in including this. I wanted to mention some of the influential themes of early funk, favela funk, that I have seen kind of shape the tone and tenor of Brazilian gangster funk. And intentionally or not, as the case may be, I think probably for the most part, not. We're not going to really get into too much into the lyrics of these songs, but once again, if you look at the index in the book, you can actually find an analysis of each of these songs in the book. But what I will tell you is, so I've kind of selected and set aside 3 songs. We're not going to listen to them either. You can do that on your own if you'd like. The first is called Rap das Armas, or the rap about firearms. And this is by, well, the authorship of this song is a little bit in dispute, but it's by Leonardo and Junior, 2 brothers from Rocinha, 2 brothers that were very helpful to me all throughout my years in Rocinha, in fact, and I consider friends. And then Cidinho and Doca, another one of perhaps, I mean, in some ways, maybe the great duo of funk from the City of God, from Cidade de Deus. And in the official studio version from 1995, the brothers from Rocinha sing the main stanzas, and then Cidinho and Doca sing the refrain. The reason that there's a bit of a dispute about the authorship is because, well, the Cidinho and Doca have very, very well-known versions of the song, which are more the underground version with the gang references, the kind that you used to not be able to sell in stores and play on the radio. But that became tremendously popular, not only in Brazil, but even worldwide because of the film Elite Squad from 2007. Both versions of that were connected to that film in different ways. So in 1995, Leonardo and Junior made a song. They created a poem out of the different weapons that you find in the favela, really mostly in the hands of the gangsters, but potentially in the hands of the police as well. The kinds of weapons that children grow up with, you know, that you see it on the corner. Maybe your friends are holding them. Who knows? Somebody from your family. And kind of as a symbol for the violence in the country. And not really glorifying the violence, denouncing the violence and saying, look, we have a problem. It's not just in the favelas, it's all throughout the entire country. So that song was a big hit. And it was actually appeared on the album, one of the few albums on a major label from funk at that time, from Colombia. And this poetic list of the firearms was quite ingenious. It's quite well put together, using the melody of the song Your Love by The Outfield from 1985. You might recognize it if you listen to that. But over time, that tendency to sort of create, to use creatively the landscape of the favela in reference to guns in particular, and the sound of guns, machine gun shots, vocalizations of the sounds of guns. This became a feature. As a matter of fact, the title of the book, Machine Gun Voices, comes in great part because of this kind of representation. So the singers sing, para pa 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 pa. Para pa 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 para pa para pa para clacky boom. Para pa 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 pa. So they're doing a vocalization of the sound of machine guns. You hear other references like this from MC Galo saying "bota o fuzil para cantar," put the gun to sing. All sorts of mixing between voice and gunfire. And you hear digital reproductions of gunshots quite frequently in this gangster music. So, for me, that was so intriguing because on the one hand, it was a sound of lament. It was a sound of denouncing the kinds of problems that people face in the communities there. The discrimination, the systemic racism, all of these kinds of the class conflict, all the forms of violence for people that are marginalized in a post-colonial context in the Afro-Atlantic world. But at the same time, there's something about this which is celebratory, something about kind of more of a utopian edge of this is our sound, this is the sound of our lives, we have relevance, we have power. And, to some degree, really, I think for all of us, no matter where we are, that we resist, we have some kind of fight against the forces of oppression, or whether it's even at a personal level. We're resisting together collectively. So you can find these kinds of representations being used as a motif throughout Brazilian gangster rap. The next song on the list is also a song that was not created as a part of Brazilian gangster rap. So Leonardo and Junior, just to be clear, for that first song, they created that song as a mainstream funk song that was sold in stores and played on the radio. Another one was Nosso Sonho, Our Dream by Claudinho Bochecha in 1997. And absolutely, well, they sing in perfect pitch, and very talented, amazingly talented singers who created, we're doing a more pop kind of variety called funky melody. But they created this I'm not sure that they're the ones that started this, but it's a great example of the creation of a poem made out of the names of favelas. So they don't just use favelas. There are other particularly working class neighborhoods, suburban neighborhoods in Rio that are put together. Listen to the song when you get a chance, and about 2.5 minutes into the song, you'll hear this list of the names of the favelas arranged poetically. It's very beautiful. Not only is it a good idea sort of aesthetically and artistically, but to me this represented a tremendous inversion of the social geography of Rio de Janeiro. Typically, the favelas are the areas that are condemned. They are criticized. They are considered undesirable by mainstream culture. And the neighborhoods that are the neighborhoods of the well-off in Portuguese are referred to as bairros nobres, or noble neighborhoods. This kind of flips that. It sort of says, these are the neighborhoods where the human, like where the very human people are, with creativity and love and friendship and all these kind of human attributes. So on top of that kind of bold social inversion, to me it has always sort of seemed that there is another kind of inversion going on at a more philosophical level. And this is something that a theme that I develop in the book, between what, people in favelas often refer to, well, the people in favelas will refer to themselves as favela, morro, comunidade, which means community, in relatively positive terms, humanizing terms. And then they refer to the formal city as asphalt, the asfalto, in somewhat alienating and dehumanizing terms. Wow, well, that's certainly part of that the inversion of the social geography. But it can also be read as an understanding of a space that is more of the rationalized space of Western modernity on the one hand, or the colonialism being the formal city, and then the space of the favela, which is a more organic kind of a space, an Afro-Atlantic space, a space of community with different notions of knowledge, power, and being, a more collective notions of knowledge, power, and being. So anyway, that's something that I find very provocative. And then the last selection that I've kind of set aside there for you is Happy do Patrão, Bandidos de Cristo by MC Dolores. You can see him in the photo here. This is a very clear example. This may be the song that I analyzed the most, like in the most in-depth way. This is a song that really kind of projects the gangs in the favela in terms of social banditry. The quickest way for you to know what I'm talking about is to evoke Robin Hood. Some kind of a notion that there is robbing from the rich to give to the poor. There is a popular hero in the gangster. Now, from the point of view of Brazilian criminology, it's been pretty clearly proven that that's not exactly really what's going on in terms of the life of crime. But the fact that there is an important sort of push on the part from everyday people to say, okay, gangsters, you want to be in control, you want to have responsibilities, you want to have power in our neighborhood, we're going to expect you to treat us basically like family members and to give us protection and to give us your friendship. And the actual name of the song, The Bandits of Christ, shows just how complex this sort of play is when you can spiritualize the gangster life in the face of the kind of law and order of the more urbanized and formerly urbanized city. So these are things you can look into. You can listen to these songs by yourself. I invite you to do so. And we're going to go on to the next slide there. I put this here so that if you wanted to, you could stop the presentation. You could look up the names of the songs that I mentioned and the artists, and you can have a chance to listen to the full versions. And then my last slide is me saying thanks, obrigado, kamsahamnida. And I wanted to tell you where this painting comes from. This painting is actually the final image in our photo gallery. We were so happy to be able to put this in. This was by the Korean-Brazilian Instagram artist called Grandpa Chan Che-lee, or E. Chan-jae. And he is an amazing person. He's a graduate of our university. He was an educator in Sao Paulo, Brazil for over 30 years and an immigrant to Brazil who recently has come back to Korea. And he came and visited my class here at the university, and I asked him, I'd seen he had done this painting of Rocinha. And I said, boy, I'd love to have that image in the photo gallery. So graciously, he let me do that. At this point, we have some great questions from my colleagues, from Professor Jung and Professor Kim. So I want to turn things over so I'll get a chance to do that. But that's it for my planned portion of the talk today. So thanks a lot.
질의응답 하겠습니다. First, thank you for your informative and interesting talk. I have several questions regarding your books and today's talk. First of all, when I read your book, the first thing that came to my mind was that your project in Rocinha is likely a challenging endeavor. As a researcher, what is the biggest difficulty you faced during the research?
Okay. Yeah, I'm so glad that you asked that question because it gave me a chance to think about that and to think about how my answer to that question is different today than it would have been in the past. I probably would have said at one point that the biggest difficulty were in things like adapting to the crowded conditions of the favela as my neighborhood, the physical challenges of living in a poor neighborhood on a hillside, pretty steep hillside, with limited resources, like the times we ran out of running water or didn't have electricity. Or maybe the police harassment that I suffered, or the violent conflicts that sometimes took place during police raids with their armored helicopters, their armored cars, and SWAT teams. Certainly, those were difficulties, quite extreme difficulties, including for some, for my friends and loved ones, and especially for my wife, who actually went through some of that with me. Today, I think of some other difficulties, though, that are more internal with me. I wanted to be a native resident so bad. When I was living in Rocinha, as you guys can see, I'm I'm a white, middle-class male from the United States. I'm an academic, and I'm also heterosexual and a Christian. I'm saying those things kind of to position myself, to show some of the things that made it hard for me to understand some of the people that I had a chance to get to know and come to love. So sometimes I think that it blurred the lines in my mind, and I underappreciated my own privilege. So I really wanted to be just like everybody else. I just spoke Portuguese all the time. I tried never to speak English, and really just kind of embrace that the life there. And the good side of that was people really wanted me to do that, and they wanted me to connect as a person. But sometimes I underestimated the differences. So I also would say, looking back, that I allowed myself when I was younger to be overly impressed by the gangsters. I mean, I'm not the only one. Lots of us like to see it's kind of cinematographic, the guns, and it's exciting. I'm sorry to say that was the case for me, but sometimes I did have that kind of feeling, and I think that that's also a limitation that I experienced, something that can be objectifying. It's a kind of sensationalism, and it's a kind of romanticism. And so that I feel like I have much more of a distance in my perspective. And also, I think maybe some of you can relate to this. I sometimes would get a big head. Just a big head. Like I thought that, oh gosh, I'm alternative, and I'm a countercultural person, and we can get some compliments. I mean, I'm here at one of Korea's premier universities, and here at our university, we also deal with this. We get lots of compliments about our roles here in the university. That can be a challenge for us to really maintain a kind of a balanced and realistic view that enables us to connect with people just as people, which is so important. So anyway, those are some of the things that I see today. I feel like I was in the right place at the right time to have this incredible experience, because so many people in Rocinha were so gracious to me and so open to me as a person. So that's what helped me to get over those challenges.
일단 지금 이 연구를 시작하시면서 겪었던 어려운 점에 대해서 질문을 드렸는데, 일단 이제 그 어려웠던 점에 대한 답은 이제 시간이 가면서 이제 좀 바뀌었는데, 일단 처음에는 그 당시에는 그런 뭔가 붐비는 이웃들 사이에서 그러니까 적응하면서 살아간다는 점, 그리고 뭐 어떤 물이 끊긴다든지 하는 그런 빈곤하고 열악한 환경 속에서 살아가는 것, 아니면은 뭐 경찰들의 어떤 폭력을 경험했다는 점, 뭐 이런 약간 신체적인 그런 어려움을 겪었었는데, 이제 지금 와서 생각해 보면은 약간 좀 본인 내부적인 어려움이 좀 있었다고 말씀을 하셨습니다. 그러니까 백인 남성이고 이성애자이고 또 중산층으로서의 그 본인의 그런 포지션을 약간 지웠어야 했다. 그런데 선생님께서는 이제 약간 본인이 그러니까 스스로 굉장히 그 갱스터에 대해서 굉장히 이제 심취해 있으셨고, 거기에 대해 약간 낭만적인 시각도 가지셨었고, 그리고 종종 본인이 굉장히 반문화적인, 대항문화적인 그런 사람이라는 어떤 자만심도 가지셨다고 합니다. 근데 지금은 이제 좀 더 그러니까 갱스터 문화뿐만이 아니라 본인에 대해서도 좀 더 좀 균형적이고 현실적인 시각을 갖게 되셨는데, 자, 모두가 이제 그 호시니아에 있었던 사람들이 굉장히 친절하게 대해줬고, 그리고 자신을 굉장히 한 인간으로서 이제 받아들였기 때문에 이제 이렇게 이제 생각할 수가 있었다. 이제 이렇게 말씀하셨습니다. Okay. Let me ask you about your methodology.
Okay.
In your book, you combined an ethnographic approach and community activism. So could you explain the difference between these two methods in detail?
Well, probably not, but I'll try. Because now that you ask, I suppose that it's not entirely possible to separate them into neat categories. I used to think that it was. There was research, and then there was activism. But the ethnographic part started in that first trip to Brazil in 1990, when I first lived in Rocinha as an undergraduate researcher studying the gangs. Then in grad school, I eventually began to actively study Brazilian funk music and culture, as I told you a little bit about earlier. But my passion for Rocinha had always been more than just about formal research, it had also been about my own personal transformation, about a chance to learn from other people. There was so much to learn from there in Hosina, I found spiritually and emotionally. So time went by. As it went by, I worked with 2 teachers in Hosina and a friend from my Brazilian university to start up 2 brothers. Over time, that work nearly totally eclipsed my research. My father was very worried. My advisor at the University of Wisconsin, Severino Albuquerque, was also worried. Boy, you're sure off task there, starting a nonprofit organization instead of doing your research. It took lots of work over many months and years, and I loved it. When the time came to begin actively researching for my doctoral thesis, I felt embarrassed to be a researcher. My identity was so much as a community, like neighbor, friend, community educator, the guy from 2 brothers, something like that. Kind of like a 선생님. You know, I was a professor. And it was a little bit difficult for me to go from that because I already had so many things that were different about me. To be a researcher, I didn't want to be seen like the other outside social scientists that came to the neighborhood, Brazilian and international. Most of them, the anthropologists, sociologists, urban planning people, they were seen as pretty foreign, pretty different. And once again, my friends and neighbors in Hosina came to the rescue. So many wanted me to do the research. They loved the idea. Hey, you're going to be a researcher and write some book about our lives? That's really cool. They wanted their voices heard. Looking back today, I can see that the research helped me as a community educator. Just like being a community educator helped me as a researcher. It helped give me a more relational perspective.
네, thank you. 두 번째로는 일단 이 책에서 적용하고 계시는 방법론에 대해서 질문을 했는데 지금 이 연구에서 선생님께서는 어떤 민족주의적인 접근 방식과 그리고 커뮤니티 액티비즘, 그러니까 커뮤니티에 들어가서 직접 활동하시는 이러한 2가지 방식을 다 이제 사용을 하셨는데 이제 질문은 그 2 방식 간에 어떤 차이가 있는지 질문을 했습니다. 근데 일단 답변은 2가지가 완벽히 구분되는 것은 아니라고 하셨습니다. 일단 선생님께서 1990년에 이제 대학생이었던 시절에 이제 처음 이제 브라질 호시니아에 가서 생활을 하셨을 때는 이제 약간 민족주의적인 접근에 일단 시작을 하셨는데 그리고 점점 이제 대학원에 들어가시고 그래서 점차 연구를 이제 확장해 가시면서 이제 점차 이제 브라질리안 펑크 뮤직과 컬처, 그러니까 뮤직 그 문화에 대해서 점점 이제 확장해 나가셨습니다. 그렇지만 그럼에도 불구하고 항상 그 호시니아에 대한 그 관심이나 열정은 항상 그 연구 이상이었다고 합니다. 그래서 어떤 그 호시니아로부터 받은 그런 인상으로부터 받은 어떤 개인적인 변화, 그러니까 정신적으로나 그리고 감정적으로나 어떤 커다란 많은 것들을 배웠고 그것이 이제 개인적인 변화로도 이어졌는데 그래서 이후에 이제 호시니아에 있던 사람들과 같이 Two Brothers Foundation을 설립하고 거기서 활동을 하시게 되었습니다. 물론 이 활동으로 인해서 이제 개인적인 연구는 약간 좀 뒤처지기는 했는데 그래서 많은 걱정을 이제 받았었는데 계속해서 이제 박사 연구를 진행을 하시면서 이제 스스로는 약간 본인이 그 커뮤니티로부터 분리되어 있다는 생각이 들어서 굉장히 좀 당황스러웠다고 이제 하셨습니다. 그래서 본인은 이렇게 외부에서 온 사회과학자처럼 그러니까 제3자 외국인으로서 이제 받아들여지기를 원하지는 않았기 때문에 굉장히 좀 당황스러운 경험을 하셨는데 이때 이제 호시니아에 있는 친구들이 이제 많은 도움이 되었다고 말씀을 하셨습니다. 그래서 거기 있는 사람들은 본인의 이야기들이 이렇게 밖으로 꺼내지기를 원했고 그래서 이제 본인 돌이켜서 생각해 보셨을 때 이제 어떤 그 커뮤니티의 교육자로서의 활동이 이제 이 연구에 많은 도움이 되었고 또 마찬가지로 이 연구 역시 그 커뮤니티에서 교육자로 활동하는 데 많이 도움이 되었다고 말씀하셨습니다. Then I was also curious about the utopianism of Bali Funk. In chapter 10 of your book, you adopted the framework of Richard Dyer's article about American musical film and their utopianism. You also mentioned that American musical film and Bali Funk are different due to the latter's high level of audience participation. So is there any unique aspect of utopianism in Bali Funk that is different from American musical film?
Yes, there is. For me, the utopian edge of favela funk is closely related to our innate need for community, for encounters, and for love. Films and other forms of storytelling and representation transport us. They can wake us up emotionally and help us connect with others and to the world around us. But live community encounters have even greater potential because our lives in community encounters are not merely ours as individuals. We have a collective life, even as a physiological level, in limbic resonance with those around us. Whether it's at a gangster funk dance party in the streets of the favela or at a picnic with our family in Nakseongdae Park, here close to the university.
예, 발리펑크의 유토피아니즘에 대해서 질문을 했는데, 그러니까 다른 문화 현상에서도 이런 유토피아니즘이 나타나지만 이제 파벨라의 발리펑크에서만 나타나는 어떤 유토피아니즘의 독특한 특징이 있는지 질문을 했습니다. 예, 거기에 대해서 이 파벨라 펑크의 유토피아니즘적인 측면은 약간 공동체나 사랑 혹은 이제 공동체의 접촉 같은 것에 대한 우리의 원초적인 욕구와 굉장히 밀접하게 관련이 있다, 이렇게 대답을 하셨습니다. 영화 같은 어떤 포맷의 스토리텔링이나 뭐 그런 문화적인 형식은 우리들을 어떻게 감정적으로 약간 일으켜주고 또 다른 사람들, 다른 세계와 이렇게 연결시켜 주기는 하지만, 그런데 실제 커뮤니티 안에서의 접촉은 좀 더 이것보다 잠재성이 있습니다. 그렇게 공동체에서 이제 접촉을 하고 서로 만나는 것은 이제 개인으로서 우리들만의 것은 아니고, 이제 우리가 좀 더 이제 집단적인 그런 생활을 하고 있는데, 그것이 우리가 파벨라의 댄스 파티, 갱스터 펑크 댄스 파티에 참여를 하든 아니면은 낙성대 공원에서 소풍을 가든 이제 어디서든 간에 우리는 이렇게 집단적인 생활을 하고 있기 때문에 이제 우리만의 것은 아니다라고 말씀을 하셨습니다. Your reading on Brazilian funk and its utopianism is not limited to Afro-Atlantic context, but expand to more universal anthropologic interpretation, such as the universal suffering of human beings and the need for peace and coexistence. So, is there any other example like Bali funk? You already mentioned candomblé and capoeira as similar cultural phenomena. Could you explain one of these in detail for those like me who are not familiar with Black Atlantic culture? Or did you find other similar examples other than Afro-Atlantic ones?
Well, thanks again. Gosh, this is such a big question. I mentioned a bit about capoeira before and some of the antiphony and that call and response and that mixture of the performance with the public, with the audience. So what I'll do instead is I think I'll talk a little bit about the broader perspective, which is I don't think that this coexistentialist soul of favela funk is unique to it or to favelas or even the Black Atlantic world. I think for historical reasons, the community encounters have been better preserved in Black Atlantic cultures like those of Rio's favelas, since there were advantages in maintaining them and there were not as many alternatives of more textual-based and rationalized spaces and practices. I believe that community encounters have always been an essential part of human ecology. Ever since the advent of the controlled use of fire in human society, I think that the use of fire, I think about the use of fire in terms of performance studies, which is something that has informed my work. The controlled use of fire in human society puts us in a circle. It totally rearranged the shape of our social lives, from little groups of people to a circle, creating a sort of prototypical theater of time together in firelight, something very unique. It's what I call pyrotopia. That's actually one of the subheadings of one of the chapters, the place of the fire. This is very essential, not just for biological changes in our diet and whatnot, but in terms of I think biological changes that happen in terms of our position in a circle like that, watching one another in this theater as we interact. For me, one of the greatest challenges of our contemporary living is in keeping these spaces of community interaction as a part of our daily lives. Collective life around communal kitchen hearths, in whatever form it may come, including but never limited to cyberspace. I mean, we have so many different ways that we gather together around these fires in a metaphorical sense, and some of them are more intense and more physiologically important than others. The challenge is in maintaining the relational side of life and being relational in everything, including politics, education, the environment, and even science. So for me, this fundamental relationality of human beings in this collective life, we have to find ways that we can connect with all of the aspects around us relationally. And I think that that's something that, kind of going from the situation of a kind of a crisis in the favelas where this is so palpable and so important for people to be able to have these refuges, that in a way that is kind of an echo of this greater need that we have in general in terms of our posture towards other people in the world around us.
예, 선생님께서 책에서 이 브라질리안 펑크에 대해서 그 브라질리안 펑크의 유토피아니즘에 대해서 굉장히 좀 보편적이고 인류학적인 그런 해석을 하셨는데, 그래서 이제 이러한 비슷한 사례가 또 있는지를 여쭤봤는데, 이제 아까 발표에서 말씀하셨던 것처럼 칸돔블레나 카포에라 같은 이제 그런 예를 이제 잠깐 설명을 해주셨고, 그것보다 좀 더 거시적인 관점에서 이제 설명을 해주셨는데, 일단 이 파벨라 펑크의 어떤 그런 공존지향적인 그런 측면이 이 파벨라 펑크 혹은 블랙 아틀란틱 세계 여기에만 이제 한정된 것은 아니라고 하셨습니다. 그런데 이런 그런 관계성, 그 커뮤니티 간의 그런 접촉성이 이런 블랙 아틀란틱 문화에 더 잘 남아있게 된 어떤 역사적인 이유를 생각해 본다면은, 일단 이러한 방식이 그들의 문화를 더 잘 유지되는데 도움이 된다, 이제 그런 해석이 있고, 그리고 또 한편으로는 이 문화의 어떤 텍스트 기반의 어떤 합리적인 공간이나 혹은 합리적인 문화에 대한 그런 대안적인 문화가 없었다, 별로 많지 않았다. 그래서 이것을 이제 역사적인 이유로 이제 꼽으셨습니다. 그리고 좀 더 거시적인 관점에서 이런 커뮤니티 내에서의 그런 접촉, 만남 같은 것들은 인간 사회에서 이제 불을 사용하기 시작한 이후로 항상 이 커뮤니티 안의 접촉성은 굉장히 중요한 요소였다. 그런데 그래서 선생님께서는 이 불의 사용을 어떤 퍼포먼스 연구의 측면에서 생각을 하셨습니다. 불이라는 것은 이제 사람들을 이제 원으로 이제 모아주는 그런 역할을 하는데, 불을 피움으로써 그 공간은 일종의 약간 초기의 원형적인 공간, 그 극장 같은 그런 공간을 형성을 하게 되고, 이런 것들은 이제 우리들의 사회적인 그런 생활에 완전히 이제 재조정하게 되었습니다. 그래서 이것을 이제 파이로토피아라고 이제 부르고 있는데요. 선생님께서 생각하시기에 이제 지금 현대 우리가 살아가는 데 있어서 가장 중요한 그런 과제 중에 하나는 이러한 커뮤니티가 서로 상호작용하는 이러한 공간을 우리의 일상생활 중의 일부로 계속 이제 유지시켜 나가야 된다, 이렇게 말씀을 하셨습니다. 그러니까 그것이 이제 어떤 형태이든 간에, 그리고 어떤 형태이든 간에 우리의 생활에 있어서 이런 관계적인 면을 지속하는 것, 그리고 어떤 뭐 분야에 상관없이 그 정치이든 교육이든 아니면 심지어 과학이든 간에 이러한 관계적인 측면을 계속 우리 안에 있는 이런 근본적인 관계성을 계속해서 추구하는 것이 중요하다, 이렇게 말씀을 하셨습니다. So my last question is, I'd like to ask you about current Bali funk. So you wrote about it in your books afterward, but how is it developing now?
Yeah, so the book is mostly about favela funk at the turn of the century, late 90s, mid to late 90s, and then the early 2000s. And funk has changed so much over the years. So Brazilian funk as a cultural movement has been around at least since the 80s, even going back to the 70s. So far, there is no post-favela funk. So sometimes you hear people say post-punk, for punk rock. There is no post-favela funk. Each generation has found tools in funk to express their voices, different electronic beats, different subgenres, dance styles, fashion, and lyrical tendencies. Early on, and this is something that, there's lots of details and it's a fascinating story, and I'm skipping over it. Early on, the focus was with baile funk dance party, whether in clubs at first or favelas afterwards. Today, the internet has changed that. There are still live spaces, like in São Paulo's Fluxus, kinds of street gatherings where people bring different cars and each car has their own sound coming out of it and it's all mixed together with street food and crowds. And there are other forms of bailes, like those in the favelas of Rio. There are battles of dancers too, even government-sponsored, competitions and things like that. But with some funk videos having over 1 billion views, as I mentioned before, to me it seems the focus has shifted primarily to the internet. But I'm older now and further removed from favela funk. I suppose it's for the younger generation of researchers to make more sense of today's funk in Brazil.
예, 마지막으로 이 발리 펑크의 현재에 대해서 질문을 했는데 일단 지금 쓰신 이 책은 90년대 말 그리고 2000년대 초반을 주로 다루고 있고요. 그리고 여기서 언급하신 이 브라질리안 펑크 같은 경우에는 이제 80년대에 주로 시작이 되었고 더 거슬러 올라가면은 70년대까지 이제 올라갑니다. 그래서 지금 시점에서 그 포스트 파벨라 펑크는 이제 나타나지 않았습니다. 각각의 그 세대는 그 자신들의 고유의 목소리를 표현하기 위해서 이제 서로 다른 전자 비트나 서로 다른 하위 장르, 다른 댄스 스타일 그리고 다른 패션이나 가사를 선택해서 이제 자신들의 방식으로 각각 다르게 자신들을 표현하고 있습니다. 그래서 처음에는 이 발리 펑크가 초점이었고 또 댄스 파티, 그러니까 그 클럽이든 아니면은 뭐 파벨라의 거리에서 이루어지던 댄스 파티가 초점이 있었는데 지금 오늘날에는 인터넷이 이것을 다 바꾸어 버렸습니다. 그래서 물론 지금도 그런 라이브 공연 장소가 있고 또 댄서들이 서로 경합을 벌이고는 있지만 그때 한편으로는 또 이제 10억 뷰가 넘는 그런 펑크 뮤직비디오가 또 있습니다. 그래서 결국은 지금 이런 상황을 봤을 때 그런 초점은 완전히 인터넷으로 넘어간 것으로 보입니다. 그런데 선생님께서는 이제 점점 나이가 드셨고 그리고 점점 이제 파벨라 펑크로부터 이제 멀어지고 계시기 때문에 이제 젊은 세대의 새로운 학자들이 이제 오늘날의 새로운 브라질 펑크를 연구해 주시기를 기대하고 계십니다. 예, 이상입니다.
강의 시작하기 전에 저한테 전달된 사전 질문이 대략 한 20, 질문이라기보다는 어떤 바람, 그러니까 그 강의가 아니고 좋은 강연 부탁드립니다, 좋은 저도와 강연 감사합니다 이런 것부터 하는데 대략 질문에 해당되는 건 한 5, 6개 정도 되는 것 같습니다. 그래서 제가 먼저 한글로 읽어드리고 질문자의 분한테 영어로 여쭤봐서 답변하게 편하시게 있습니다. 1번 질문은 좀 제가 볼 때 약간 뭐랄까 쉽지 않은 질문인데 교수님 대한민국에도 브라질의 갱스터와 같은 부류가 있다고 느끼시나요? The question is, do you think there are Korean gangsters similar to Brazilian gangsters? I strongly believe that you have never met any Korean gangster in person, but I thought probably I think I'd like to just what is the image of a Korean gangsters on your mind? You can just tell us about it.
Okay, boy, yeah, that's a really interesting question. So I've been living in Korea for 6 years. My knowledge of Korean culture, history, language isn't as good as I'd like it to be, but I definitely have made a really big effort. I love Korea. I love Korean. I watch Hanguk drama with my wife as a hobby. We've seen, scores of dramas. So I've seen lots of representations of Korean gangsters in film and on television, and even in documentary and things like that. But you're right, I don't know, particularly I don't happen to know any, and I haven't done any kind of study like that. I'm guessing that there's something similar in a sense of, there typically is some kind of a view of some sort of an internal code, an understanding of how things should be done. It's not just, wanton violence or something like that. There's a kind of a notion of what's right and wrong. In Brazil, there's a saying, "Tô no lado certo da vida errada." I'm on the right side of the wrong life. So there's kind of a way that you're supposed to be a good gangster as opposed to just being a dangerous and a destructive gangster.
Human aspect.
Yeah, I think that's probably going to be true. I don't know a whole lot about it, obviously, as you mentioned, but I'm guessing something along that. I kind of see a parallel there.
말씀인 게 우리가 보통 갱스터하면 일반적으로 그러니까 좋은 좀 따뜻한 마음씨를 갖고 있는 갱스터들이 존재하기 때문에 일반적으로 전체적인 걸 볼 때는 우리가 그러니까 그 잘못된 삶에서 그래도 조금 괜찮은 길, 뭐 그런 정도의 또 좋은 마음. 원래가 그렇게 가서는 안 되는데 인생이었는데 그렇게 흘러갔지만 그런 좋은 마음을 갖고 있는 갱스터들이 있기 때문에 그런 것들은 좀 브라질이나 한국이나 비슷한 것 같다고 들어봤습니다. 이거는 조금 이게 제가 그거가 아마 대충 그러니까 일부 한글 질문들은 제가 읽어봐도 좀 무슨 말인지 모르겠는데 이 민족지학 그 연구할 때 나의 한마디가 나의 시선이 그 사람들의 삶에 커다란 영향을 주는 경우가 생길 것 같은데 그런 경우는 어떻게 대처하셨나요? 그리고 영어로 질문을 함께 해주셨어요. When do you do ethnographic research? I think there will be a case in which your eyes or your words have a great influence on their lives. And how did you cope with it? Probably the person who is raising this question wants to know about the a researcher's biases and preconceptions. How did you deal with that when you did research in Brazil?
It sounds like maybe the person asking this question is interested to think about how my presence and my regard could shape things and influence things, especially because I wasn't trying to be just an objective person looking for informants, but I was a member of the community who was interacting with people in relationships and friendships. Yeah, I mean, I think that, I don't know, there's a lot of thoughts that go through my head. I think that's a very complex question and an important one. I'm not sure if I can really give a satisfying answer to it. But I can think of, on the one hand, I can think of times where people specifically said, there was one friend of mine who was he had a small involvement with the gang, but a resident who befriended me early on. And he told me at one point, the day that I actually did a formal interview with him, he said, "This is one of the best things that ever happened to me." I found that very touching and very surprising. And I was not entirely comfortable with that, to think that me asking him some questions and giving him a chance to answer questions would be so important to him. But anyway, for him, that was an important experience. I can only imagine that it was because of the sort of neglect that he'd experienced, that to have somebody that he thought a lot of me, he did think I was a nice person, that I would give him a chance to tell his story. But I don't want to romanticize and say that it was always that way. I'm sure that there was, the difference between a tourist who comes into the favela for a sensationalist kind of thing and an anthropologist is not as big as we might think. And the difference between an anthropologist and whatever it was, I was a community activist, it still isn't as different as we think. So I think that I often thought, I was comfortable, like, well, I'm not an anthropologist, I'm a community educator, I'm a person first. But I think that I had a lot of limitations about the effect of that. I'm sure that we were bringing in, through our NGO, we brought in people that, whether it was me or other people, that inadvertently objectified people in the community and created a kind of some sort of superficial, dehumanizing kind of tone. So there's a lot of things I could say about this if I ever have a chance to talk to that person. There's a lot of episodes that come to mind. But it's a complex question, and I appreciate it.
어떻게 보면 이제 우리가 투어리스트로서 그 커뮤니티에 들어가서 관광객으로 가는 입장하고 인류학자 들어가서 좀 더 객관적이라 그럴까요? 그런 연구도 하는 거하고 또 커뮤니티 에듀케이터로서 들어가서 좀 더 퍼스널한 거고 사실 인터뷰를 했을 때 거기 살고 있는 사람, 인터뷰의 대상이 되는 사람도 자기가 사실은 늘 겪고 있는 일이지만 미처 깨닫지 못했던 것들, 이런 것들을 알게 되는 하나의 계기. So the interviewing is a kind of an opportunity for you and the person interviewee. It's kind of a mutual, it's a chance to understand each other. And you think that?
Well, one of the reasons I was afraid to do these interviews, I thought it might be less mutual than just hanging out with people, just hanging out, living life together. But there was something about it that kind of framing it in terms of you're telling me things that I will then interpret for other people in the larger society and have hopefully help them to understand better your life and the community here. I think that there's a certain kind of trust. So, you know, in many cases, it was like quite a positive experience for me to be out of the role of just sort of your friend and a community educator and to be an actual academic researcher. So I think that it was a different way for us to understand one another.
그러니까 어떻게 보면 이제 거기에 하나의 멤버이기도 하지만 또한 아카데믹 그런 리서처로서의 그런 것도 이게 좀 복잡하죠. 그러니까 이게 like as a scholar and as a friend.
Yeah.
그러니까 이런 두 가지 요소들이 최소한도 근데 여러 가지 상황이 복잡하기 때문에 사실 한 가지로 설명할 수는 없지만 어쨌든 간에 거기서 우리가 그 경험을 바탕으로 박사 논문을 쓴다고 한다면은 그때는 이제 퍼스널한 것도 있지만 또 하나의 어떤 스칼라로서의 그런 어떤 관찰이라 그럴까요? 그런 것들이 한꺼번에 복합적으로 존재하기 때문에 이거는 좀 쉽지 않은 생각이 듭니다. So, do you see 이게 파벨라 이것이 하나의 브라질 펑크라는 것이 자신의 목소리를 내는 것을 새로운 저항의 사회 운동으로도 볼 수 있을까요? 하는 질문이에요. 그러니까 do you see the Brazilian punk as a form of resistance to the hegemony and the dominant culture?
I think I saw it that way in the beginning, and now I see it as a complex kind of musical movement that includes resistance, and it also includes other ways that it's actually quite typical of mainstream Brazilian society. It's not entirely revolutionary, but certainly there's aspects of it that are.
어떤 그러니까 이게 저항의 문화로서를 갖고 있지만 그거보다 훨씬 더 복잡하고 그래서 단순하게 그냥 하나의 저항, 레볼루션을 위한 그런 거는 아니라고 봅니다. 처음에는 그렇게 생각을 했었었는데 지금 아니면 좀 더 유연하게 바라보시고 계신다는 거고요. 마지막 질문은 펑크 음악에 가장 크게 영향을 미치는 사회적인 요인은 무엇이라고 생각하시나요? 그러니까 what social element has the most powerful impact on the formation of Brazilian funk?
Well, a lot of things go through my mind. It's hard to choose one, but I would say that in some ways, kind of like life itself, there are difficulties, and then there are, celebration, or there are hardships in some of the social and political factors that I mentioned that make life difficult. But then there's also a kind of release, that utopian and that community side. So it's kind of the combination of those factors which really in some ways are, that's what makes up our lives anyway, right? We have kind of a push and then we have some closeness and we have all of these different kind of things.
사실은 이제 우리가 김민춘에도 느끼지만 일상생활의 고달픔이라든가 어려움이라든가 이런 것도 있지만 하나의 그 커뮤니티 내에서 형성된 어떤 공동체의 어떤 유대의식, 연대의식 이런 것들이 하나의 또 다른 돌파구 같은 걸 제공하기 때문에 딱 우리가 하나로 어떤 걸 단정해서 얘기하기는 좀 어렵다 이런 말씀을 주셨습니다. 이것으로서 지금 사진 질문에 대한 질의응답은 다 된 것 같습니다. 그러면 강연도 해주시고 질의에 굉장히 성실하게 잘 답변해 주신 폴순희 선생님께 깊이 감사드립니다. Thank you so much.
Hey, thank you guys.